When over 10 cops storm a black barbershop, accusing him of crime, they're stunned to learn he's an FBI boss. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to catch our latest videos. The bell above the barbershop door didn't jingle. It crashed, the sound slicing through the hum of clippers and laughter like a gunshot. Marcus Hayes froze mid-cut, his clippers hovering over a young man's fade, as 3 Chicago PD officers stormed into his small shop on 63rd Street, their boots pounding the linoleum with menace. The lead officer, Patrick Callahan, a white man with a square jaw and a smirk that oozed contempt, locked eyes with Marcus, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Everybody out," Callahan barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Customers scrambled, chairs scraping as men grabbed their jackets and teens bolted for the door, leaving half-finished haircuts and a cloud of tension in their wake. Marcus, a wiry black man in his mid-40s with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing, set his clippers down slowly, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the fire of a man who'd been pushed too far. His shop, a cornerstone of Chicago's South Side, was no stranger to police harassment, squad cars idling outside, random checks that felt like accusations. But this was different. Callahan's presence, flanked by 2 other white officers with grim faces, carried a weight that screamed trouble. "What's this about, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with steel, his hands visible on the counter. Callahan stepped closer, his smirk widening as he scanned the shop, mirrors reflecting the chaos of overturned chairs and scattered combs. "Got a tip, Hayes," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Word is your little haircut joint's a front for something dirty. Drugs? Maybe? Or worse." The accusation landed like a slap, and the few remaining customers, old Mr. Jenkins clutching his cane, a teen named Dion hovering near the door, gasped. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't blink. He'd heard this script before, the same tired narrative that painted a black man's success as a crime waiting to be uncovered. For years, he'd endured the precinct's scrutiny, their eyes boring into his shop as if his very existence was a threat. But today, Callahan's boldness, the way he strutted in like he owned the place, lit a spark in Marcus that he struggled to contain. "You got a warrant?" Marcus asked, his voice low, each word deliberate. Callahan laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the now empty shop. "Don't need one when we've got probable cause. Anonymous tip says you're trouble, and I'm inclined to believe it." He leaned in close enough for Marcus to smell the coffee on his breath. "You think you're slick, don't you? Running this place like you're some kind of king? But we see you, Hayes, and we're done playing nice." The other officers fanned out, one kicking over a stack of magazines, another pulling open drawers behind the counter, their movements a deliberate show of power. Dion, still lingering by the door, shouted, "This ain't right, man. Mr. Hayes ain't done nothing." Callahan spun, pointing a finger at the teen. "You want to join him in cuffs? Kid, get out!" Dion hesitated, his fists clenched. But Mr. Jenkins tugged him toward the door, muttering, "Don't make it worse." Marcus raised a hand, a silent signal for calm, his eyes never leaving Callahan's. He knew this wasn't just about a tip, it was personal, a message from a precinct that resented his presence, his success, his refusal to bow. But what Callahan didn't know, what no one in the shop or the neighborhood knew, was that Marcus Hayes was more than a barber. Beneath the faded apron, behind the easy smile that disarmed customers, was a covert FBI agent, a man who'd spent the last 18 months embedded in the South Side, unraveling a drug trafficking empire that stretched from street corners to the upper echelons of power. His shop was a front, a perfect cover that let him listen to the neighborhood's pulse, gather whispers about dealers, and track the flow of dirty money. Every night in a locked back room, Marcus decrypted files on a hidden laptop, piecing together a case that could topple kingpins and expose corrupt cops who might be shielding them. He was close, dangerously close, to breaking the network, And the sudden escalation from Callahan's crew wasn't a coincidence. Someone was rattled, and Marcus's gut told him it wasn't just the dealers. As Callahan's men tore through his shop, tossing clipper heads and flipping chairs, Marcus stood still, his mind racing. He couldn't blow his cover, not when the stakes were this high, but he also couldn't let this harassment slide. The community was watching, their trust in him hanging by a thread. If he backed down, he'd lose their respect. If he pushed back too hard, he risked exposing his mission. "You're making a mistake, officer," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos, sharp and unafraid. Callahan turned, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the steel in Marcus's tone. "Mistake?" he scoffed, stepping so close their chests nearly touched. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can play us. This shop's done, Hayes, and you're coming with us." He nodded to his men, who produced zip ties, their intent clear. Marcus's pulse quickened, not from the threat, but from the calculation of his next move. He could end this now, reveal his badge, call his handler, watch Callahan's face collapse, but that would unravel months of work. Instead, he let his shoulders relax, his face softening into a mask of compliance, but his eyes burned with a promise. This wasn't over. As the officers grabbed his arms, Marcus caught Dion's wide-eyed stare from the doorway, the teen's fists still clenched. "Stay cool, Dion," Marcus said, his voice steady even as the zip ties bit into his wrists. "This ain't the end." Callahan shoved him toward the door, but Marcus moved with purpose, his head high, the weight of his secret anchoring him. Outside, a crowd was gathering, neighbors murmuring, phones raised to record the scene. The squad cars waited, lights flashing, but Marcus's mind was already elsewhere, plotting the moment he'd turn the tables. He'd spent years playing this game, patience, precision, power held in reserve, and Callahan had just made the first move in a fight he couldn't win. The barbershop fell silent as the door slammed shut, but Marcus Hayes was already planning his next cut, one that would slice through the lies and leave the truth bleeding out. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago PD's holding cell buzzed like a swarm of angry wasps, casting a cold glare over Marcus Hayes as he sat on the metal bench, his wrists still raw from the zip ties that had bound him hours earlier. The air was stale, thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair, but Marcus's face remained unreadable, his sharp brown eyes fixed on the cracked concrete wall as if it held the answers to the storm brewing outside. The precinct had released him just before dawn. No charges filed, no apologies offered. Just a curt nod from a desk sergeant and a warning to stay out of trouble. Callahan and his crew hadn't been there to see him walk out, but Marcus could feel their presence lingering, a shadow that clung to him like the Southside's summer heat. He'd returned to his barbershop at sunrise, the shattered calm of the previous day's raid still evident in the overturned chairs and scattered combs, a silent testament to the precinct's aggression. The community was buzzing, whispers spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some called Marcus a victim. Others wondered if the cops had a point, their trust in him fraying under the weight of doubt. Marcus knew this wasn't just about Callahan's bruised ego. The raid, the anonymous tip, the sudden escalation, it all pointed to something bigger. Something tied to the drug trafficking network he was closing in on as a covert FBI agent. His cover was still intact, but the noose was tightening, and he had to move carefully, balancing the role of a humble barber with the mission that could shake Chicago's underworld to its core. As he swept up the debris in his shop, the bell jingled, and Dion, the teen who'd stood up for him during the raid, slipped inside, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and worry. "Mr. Stees, you good?" Dion asked, his voice low, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting cops to burst in again. Marcus forced a smile, setting the broom aside. "I'm still standing, kid. Takes more than a few badges to shut me down." Dion nodded, but his frown deepened. "They're saying stuff, man. On the block, online, folks think you might be mixed up in something. I told them it's nonsense, but..." He trailed off, and Marcus felt a pang in his chest. Not for himself, but for the kid, for the community caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't even know was raging. He clapped a hand on Dion's shoulder, his voice firm. Let him talk. Truth's got a way of coming out. But as Dion left, Marcus's smile faded, his mind racing. The precinct's scrutiny was intensifying. Squad cars now parked blatantly across the street, officers stopping customers outside the shop to ask questions. Their presence a deliberate pressure campaign. Callahan had been quiet since the raid, but his absence felt more ominous than his taunts, like a predator circling before the strike. Marcus knew the game. They were trying to break him, to force a mistake that would justify their suspicions or push him out of the neighborhood. What they didn't know was that Marcus was playing a game of his own, one with stakes far higher than a barbershop's survival. That night, in the locked back room of his shop, Marcus powered up his encrypted laptop, the screen's glow illuminating his face as he sifted through surveillance logs and intercepted communications. The drug network was vast, moving product through Chicago's ports and into the Midwest, with layers of protection that reached into the city's power structures. Marcus had identified key players, a dock worker with a side hustle, a club owner laundering cash, but the linchpin, the figure shielding the operation, remained elusive. His latest lead pointed to a corrupt official, possibly within law enforcement, and the timing of the raid made him wonder if he'd gotten too close. As he cross-referenced data, a noise outside snapped him back to the present, a low rumble, like an engine idling too long. He killed the laptop screen, moving silently to the shop's front window, where a squad car sat under a street light, its driver obscured but his message clear. We're watching. Marcus's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the realization that the precinct's pressure wasn't just harassment, it was a signal. Someone in the network knew he was digging, and they were using the cops as pawns to slow him down. The next morning, the shop was quieter than usual, the regular buzz of conversation replaced by cautious glances and hushed voices. Mr. Jenkins, usually a fountain of complaints about the bulls, sat silently, his eyes flicking to the window where another squad car idled. A new customer, a wiry man with a scar above his brow, walked in, his demeanor too polished for the neighborhood. Marcus caught the man's quick scan of the shop, the way his hand lingered near his waistband, and his instinct screamed, this wasn't a haircut. What are you looking for? Marcus asked, his tone casual, but his eyes locked on the man's reflection in the mirror. The stranger smirked, settling into a chair. Just a trim? Heard this place is interesting. The word hung heavy, a probe disguised as small talk. Marcus picked up his clippers, his movements deliberate, every sense on high alert. The man's questions were too pointed, about the shop's hours, its customers, the cops outside, and Marcus deflected with practiced ease, his barber's charm masking the calculations in his mind. This wasn't a random visit, it was a test. Maybe from the network, maybe from someone closer. As he finished the cut, the stranger leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. Careful, Barber. Folks are talking. You don't want the wrong kind of attention. Marcus met his gaze in the mirror, his smile cold. I've had plenty of attention lately. Ain't fazed me yet. The man left without another word, but Marcus knew the encounter was a warning, a thread in a web that was closing around him. By midday, the precinct's pressure campaign escalated further. 2 officers, not Callahan but his cronies, entered the shop under the pretense of a routine inspection, demanding to see Marcus's business license and grilling him about his customers. The interrogation drew a small crowd outside, neighbors watching with a mix of fear and frustration. Their phones raised to record. Marcus complied, his voice steady, but the weight of their scrutiny was suffocating, each question a jab meant to provoke. When they finally left, Mr. Jenkins spoke up, his voice trembling with rare anger. They're trying to run you out, Marcus. You gonna let them? The question hung in the air, and Marcus felt every eye on him. Customers, neighbors, even Dion, who'd slipped back in. He wanted to tell him the truth, to reveal the badge he carried in his soul, but his mission demanded silence. Instead, he picked up his clippers, his voice low but resolute. "They can try, but this shop ain't going nowhere, and neither am I." The words rallied the room, but Marcus knew the real fight was coming. That night, as he locked up, a text from his FBI handler flashed on his burner phone. "They're circling. Stay sharp." Marcus glanced at the squad car still parked across the street, its lights a silent threat. He was running out of time, caught between a community he couldn't fully confide in and a network that was starting to suspect him. The barbershop, his sanctuary, was now a battlefield, and Marcus Hayes was ready to draw the line. Fun ba cow chow. Kwokdo Kit, the south side sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Chicago sky in streaks of orange and gray, when the barbershop's bell rang out with a violence that stopped Marcus Hayes' clippers mid-cut. He was shaping up Mr. Jenkins' gray curls, the old man's grumbling about the city's potholes filling the shop's warm air, when the door exploded inward, and a swarm of over 10 Chicago PD officers, all white, stormed in like a tidal wave, their tactical vests and drawn batons turning the sanctuary of 63rd Street into a war zone. The shop erupted in chaos. Customers leaped from chairs. A teen dropped his phone mid-video, and Dion, who'd been sweeping hair in the corner, froze, his broom clattering to the floor. Leading the charge was Officer Patrick Callahan, his square jaw set, his blue eyes burning with a triumph that made Marcus's stomach twist. "Nobody move," Callahan roared, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the room, his hand gripping a megaphone as if commanding a battlefield. The officers fanned out, blocking exits, overturning chairs, and ripping posters from the walls. Their movements a choreographed assault meant to intimidate. Marcus set his clippers down, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins, his sharp brown eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a man who'd faced worse odds. He knew this was no routine check. This was a spectacle, a public execution of his reputation, orchestrated to break him in front of the community he'd sworn to protect. Callahan strode forward, a rolled-up document in his hand, his smirk as sharp as a blade. "Marcus Hayes, this shop is being shut down for violations of public safety and suspected criminal activity," he declared, thrusting the paper at Marcus, who didn't flinch. "We've got multiple complaints, credible tips, and enough cause to lock you up for good." The words were a gut punch, each syllable laced with the weight of months of harassment, of squad cars circling, of whispers poisoning the neighborhood's trust. Mr. Jenkins stood, his cane trembling as he pointed at Callahan. "This is a damn disgrace! Marcus ain't no criminal!" But an officer shoved him back into his chair, barking, "Sit down, old man!" Dion took a step forward, his fist clenched, but Marcus raised a hand, his voice low and commanding. "Easy, Dion. Let him talk." His calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos, and for a fleeting moment, Callahan's smirk faltered, as if he sensed something beneath Marcus's composure that didn't add up. The officers began sealing the shop, slapping yellow tape across the door and windows, while two of them grabbed Marcus's arms, their grip bruising as they yanked him toward the counter. Outside, a crowd was forming, neighbors pressing against the glass, their faces a mix of shock and fury, phones raised to capture the injustice unfolding. "You're making a scene for nothing," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the din, his eyes locked on Callahan's. "You got no evidence, no warrant, just a hunch and some bad blood." Callahan laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the mirrors. "Evidence? We've got enough to bury you. Hayes, this shop's a front, and everybody knows it. You think you're untouchable, but you're done." He leaned in, his breath hot against Marcus's ear, his voice a venomous whisper. "Should have left when you had the chance." The words were a spark to the tinder of Marcus's restraint, but he didn't break, not yet. He knew Callahan's bravado was a mask, a desperate play to assert control. But Marcus wasn't just a barber caught in a raid. He was a covert FBI agent, a man who'd spent 18 months weaving a web to trap a drug trafficking empire that stretched from Chicago's docks to its precincts. And this raid was no accident. The tips, the accusations, the timing, it all screamed interference, a move by someone in the network to derail his investigation before he could expose them. Marcus had been close to identifying the operation's protector, a figure high enough to shield dealers from the law, and Callahan's aggression suggested he was either a pawn or something worse. As the officers cuffed Marcus's wrists, the cold steel biting into his skin, he caught Dion's anguished stare, the teen's eyes pleading for him to fight back. "Don't let him do this, Mr. Hayes," Dion shouted, shoving past an officer before being restrained. Marcus held his gaze, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay strong, kid. This ain't the end." The words were a promise, not just to Dion but to himself, a vow that he'd turn this ambush into a reckoning. The officers dragged him through the shop, past the yellow tape and shattered dreams, into the glare of the flashing squad car lights outside. The crowd surged, neighbors shouting, "Let him go!" And "This is wrong!" But the police line held firm. Batons raised to keep them at bay. Callahan paraded Marcus like a trophy, shoving him toward a waiting van, his smirk now a full grin as he soaked in the spectacle. Marcus stumbled but caught himself, his head high, his face a mask of defiance that unsettled the younger officers trailing behind. They couldn't know that Marcus Hayes carried a badge far more powerful than theirs, one that could flip this entire scene upside down. In his mind, he was already mapping the fallout, the call he'd make to his handler, the evidence he'd secured on his encrypted laptop, the names he'd connected to the network. This raid wasn't just an attack on his shop, it was a desperate attempt to silence him. And Marcus had spent too long in the shadows to let it succeed. As the van's doors slammed shut, plunging him into darkness, he leaned back against the cold metal, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Callahan thought he'd won, but Marcus knew better. The real game was just beginning, and when the truth came out, it wouldn't just free him, it would burn through the precinct like wildfire, exposing every lie, every dirty deal, every hand that thought it could crush him. The van rumbled to life, carrying Marcus toward the precinct, but in his heart, he was already cutting through the noise, his blade sharper than any clipper, ready to carve out justice in a city that had underestimated him for far too long. The holding cell in the Chicago PD's precinct was a tomb of flickering fluorescent light and echoing shouts, its concrete walls pressing in on Marcus Hayes as he leaned against the cold metal bench, his wrists still bruised from the cuffs that had bound him during the raid on his barbershop. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat and bleach, but Marcus's face was a mask of calm, his sharp brown eyes glinting with a quiet fire that betrayed nothing of the storm raging inside him. Hours had passed since Callahan and his squad of over 10 white officers had stormed his shop, Niem Fong his livelihood with yellow tape, and dragged him through the south side like a trophy. Their accusations of public safety violations and criminal activity ringing hollow in his ears. The precinct buzzed with activity beyond the cell, officers laughing, phones ringing, the clatter of paperwork. But Marcus sat still, his mind a razor, slicing through the chaos to the truth beneath. This wasn't just harassment, it was a calculated strike, a desperate move by someone in the drug trafficking network he'd been hunting as a covert FBI agent for 18 months. Callahan's raid, the anonymous tips, the escalation, it all pointed to a nerve he'd struck, a shadow figure in the network who knew Marcus was closing in. As he traced the threads of his investigation in his mind, dock workers, club owners, and whispers of a corrupt official shielding the operation, a low chuckle broke his focus. Callahan stood outside the cell, his broad frame silhouetted against the bars, his smirk as sharp as ever, his blue eyes gleaming with the arrogance of a man who thought he'd won. "Comfortable, Hayes?" Callahan taunted, tapping his baton against the bars with a rhythmic clang. Told you we'd shut you down. That little shop of yours, it's history, and you're gonna sit here until we figure out just how deep your mess goes. Marcus didn't respond right away, letting the officer's words hang in the stale air, his silence a weapon sharper than any retort. He tilted his head, studying Callahan like a predator sizing up prey, noting the faint sweat on the officer's brow, the slight twitch in his jaw. Callahan was nervous, despite his bravado, and Marcus knew why. This raid was a gamble, a bold move to silence him before he could expose the truth. "You're awfully sure of yourself, officer," Marcus finally said, his voice low, each word measured, cutting through the cell's oppressive hum. "But you're standing on quicksand, and you don't even know it." Callahan's smirk faltered, his baton pausing mid-tap, but he recovered quickly, leaning closer to the bars, his voice a venomous hiss. "Big talk for a barber in a cage. Keep it up, and we'll add resisting arrest to your sheet. Nobody's coming for you. Hayes, not your customers, not your neighborhood. Nobody." The words were meant to wound, to break the spirit of a man already cuffed and cornered, but Marcus's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a spark of defiance that sent a shiver through Callahan's confidence. Before the officer could press further, a sharp buzz interrupted, the precinct's intercom crackling to life, with a voice that carried an authority neither man expected. "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately. Federal agents on site. This is not a drill." The words hit like a thunderbolt, and Callahan's face drained of color, his baton slipping slightly in his grip as he turned toward the sound. Marcus's smile widened, just enough to be noticed, and Callahan snapped back, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What's so funny?" he demanded. But Marcus said nothing, his silence louder than any answer, his gaze a blade that cut through the officer's bravado. The cell block door swung open and a young officer rushed in, his face pale, his voice urgent. "Callahan, they need you upstairs, now. It's the FBI." Callahan froze, his jaw tightening, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. The officer shot Marcus a final glare before storming out, the cell door clanging shut behind him. But Marcus knew the real show was about to begin. Alone again. He leaned back, his mind racing, calculating the moves ahead. His handler had been briefed the moment he was cuffed, a protocol he'd set up for exactly this scenario, and the FBI's arrival was no coincidence. The raid had crossed a line, and Marcus was ready to flip the script. Minutes later, the cell block door opened again, and two men in crisp suits stepped inside, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent light, their faces stern but professional. The lead agent, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, unlocked Marcus's cell, her voice clipped. "Agent Hayes, you're clear. We've got jurisdiction now." The words were a bombshell, though spoken quietly, and the young officer trailing behind gasped, his eyes wide as he realized the man in the cell wasn't just a barber. Marcus stood, brushing off his apron, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding despite the bruises on his wrists. "Took you long enough," he said, a wry edge to his voice, but his eyes were locked on the corridor, where he knew Callahan was about to face a reckoning. The briefing room was a pressure cooker when Marcus entered, flanked by the FBI agents, his faded barber's apron replaced by an air of authority that silenced the room. Over a dozen officers, including Callahan and his raid team, stood rigid, their faces a mix of confusion and dread as they registered Marcus's presence. Callahan, at the front, went rigid, his smirk gone, his eyes darting between DeMarcus and the agents like a cornered animal. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm Special Agent Torres, FBI. As of now, this precinct is under federal review due to credible allegations of misconduct and interference with an ongoing investigation. Marcus Hayes, whom you detained, is a covert operative with this agency, outranking every officer in this room." A collective gasp rippled through the officers, and Callahan's face turned ashen, his hands clenching into fists as the weight of his mistake crashed down. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Callahan's, his voice steady but laced with steel. "You thought you could bury me. Officer, thought a barber from the south side was an easy mark, but you picked the wrong fight." The room was deathly silent, every officer frozen, their eyes darting between Marcus and Callahan, who stammered, his voice hoarse. I didn't know. I thought—" Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp, unyielding. "You didn't think, you assumed. And that assumption just cost you more than you can imagine." Torres raised a hand, her voice commanding attention. "Officer Callahan, you and your team are suspended pending a full investigation. We have evidence suggesting some of you may be linked to the very network Agent Hayes is dismantling. Step out now." The words were a death knell, and Callahan staggered back, his bravado shattered, his career hanging by a thread. Marcus stood tall, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in the stunned faces of officers who'd laughed at him, who'd sealed his shop, who'd thought him powerless. He wasn't just a barber anymore. He was a force, a man who'd turned their game against them. As Callahan was escorted out, Marcus's mind shifted to the next move. The network was still out there, and this raid had only deepened his resolve. The barbershop was down, but Marcus Hayes was just getting started, and the truth he carried would cut deeper than any blade. The South Side morning is heavy with the scent of rain and the buzz of a neighborhood on edge. Its pulse quickened by the news that Marcus Hayes had walked out of the Chicago PD's precinct not as a prisoner, but as a man who had turned their world upside down. His barbershop on 63rd Street, still scarred with the yellow tape and overturned chairs from the raid, stood like a battleground, drawing crowds of neighbors who whispered in awe and anger, their phones flashing as they documented the aftermath. Marcus stepped out of a black SUV, flanked by 2 FBI agents in crisp suits, his faded barber's apron gone, replaced by a dark jacket that carried an air of authority no one in the crowd could miss. His sharp brown eyes scanned the faces. Mr. Jenkins leaning on his cane, Dion clutching a broom with fierce pride, women from the block murmuring prayers, and he felt the weight of their trust, a fragile thread he'd fought to preserve through months of silence as a covert FBI agent. The raid, the cuffs, the accusations of criminal activity had shaken the community, but Marcus's release and the bombshell of his true identity had lit a fire, one that now burned in the eyes of those who'd gathered to see what he'd do next. He hadn't come to gloat, he'd come to reclaim his shop, his mission, and the truth that had been buried under Callahan's lies. As he approached the shop, the crowd parted, their murmurs swelling into cheers, but Marcus raised a hand, his voice low and commanding. "This ain't over yet," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise, and the crowd hushed, sensing the storm still brewing. Inside, the shop was a wreck, mirrors cracked, clippers scattered, the air thick with the dust of violation. But Marcus stood tall, his presence a defiance of the chaos. The FBI agents, led by Special Agent Torres, moved to secure the perimeter, their radios crackling with updates as they coordinated with federal teams now swarming the precinct. Marcus knew the raid wasn't just a mistake. It was a desperate move by the drug trafficking network he'd been dismantling, a network that stretched from Chicago's docks to its power corridors, protected by someone with enough influence to weaponize the police against him. Callahan and his team were suspended, their careers hanging by a thread. But Marcus suspected some of them weren't just pawns. They were players, tied to the very empire he was hunting. The precinct had scheduled a public meeting that afternoon, a chance for the community to demand answers, and Marcus intended to turn it into a reckoning. As he swept up debris, Dion slipped inside, his eyes blazing with a mix of awe and urgency. "Mr. Hayes, Agent Hayes," he corrected himself, stumbling over the title. "They're saying the cops are scared, saying you're gonna bring the whole precinct down. That true?" Marcus paused, his broom still, his gaze meeting Dion's. "Not the precinct, Kid, just the ones who forgot what the badge means. Dion nodded, his jaw tight, and Marcus saw in him the spark of a generation that could demand better, a spark he'd protect at all costs. By noon, the community center down the block was packed, its folding chairs filled with neighbors, activists, and reporters, their voices a cacophony of outrage and hope. Marcus entered with Torres, the FBI's presence a silent warning to the precinct brass seated at the front, Captain Reynolds, a gray-haired man with a forced smile, and a handful of officers who avoided Marcus's gaze. Callahan was absent, his suspension a fresh wound, but his team sat stiffly, their faces pale under the glare of TV cameras. Reynolds stood, clearing his throat, his voice strained as he addressed the crowd. We're here to address recent events and restore trust. The raid on Mr. Hayes' shop was based on credible tips, but we acknowledge mistakes were made. The crowd erupted, boos and shouts drowning him out, and Marcus felt the room's anger like a living thing, a force he could channel. He stepped forward, uninvited, his presence commanding silence as he took the microphone, his eyes sweeping the room before locking onto the officers. Mistakes, he said, his voice low but sharp, each word a blade. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. A choice to target a black man's business, to tear apart a community's heart, because you assumed I was nothing, but you were wrong. The room hung on his words, the air electric with anticipation, and Marcus let the silence stretch, his gaze pinning the officers like insects. I'm Special Agent Marcus Hayes, FBI. For 18 months, I've been embedded in this neighborhood, running that shop as a cover to dismantle a drug network that's poisoning our streets. And you, he pointed at the officers, his voice rising with controlled fury, you didn't just raid my shop. You tried to bury an investigation that could save lives. Why? Because someone told you to. Someone who's scared of what I'm about to find. A gasp rippled through the crowd, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras zooming in on the officers' ashen faces. Captain Reynolds stammered, Agent Hayes, we had no knowledge of your status. But Marcus cut him off, his voice a whip crack. You didn't need to know who I was to do your job right, but you chose to listen to lies, to tips that came from nowhere, because it was easier than questioning your own bias. The crowd roared, their applause a tidal wave, and Marcus saw Dion in the back, his fist raised, Mr. Jenkins nodding fiercely beside him. Torres stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. The FBI is now investigating this precinct for potential collusion with the network Agent Hayes is targeting. We have evidence suggesting some officers may have protected traffickers. Knowingly or not, this meeting is your chance to come clean. The officers shifted, their discomfort palpable, and Marcus caught a flicker of fear in one man's eyes, a younger cop who'd been at the raid, his hands trembling as he avoided Torres's gaze. The room was a pressure cooker, every word tightening the screws, and Marcus knew he'd struck a nerve. The network's protector, the figure he'd been chasing, was closer than he'd thought, and this public confrontation was forcing their hand. As the meeting ended, the crowd surged toward Marcus, neighbors shaking his hand, reporters shouting questions, but he kept his focus on the officers, watching their retreat like rats from a sinking ship. Back at the shop, he stood among the wreckage, Torres at his side, her voice low. You've got their attention, Hayes, but you've also got a target on your back. Whoever's behind this knows you're close. We're pulling in surveillance, but you need to watch your step. Marcus nodded, his eyes on the street, where a lone squad car lingered, its driver obscured. The community was rallying, their faith in him restored, but the fight was far from over. The network was rattled, and Marcus was ready to pull the thread that would unravel it all, even if it meant facing down the precinct, the dealers, and the shadow pulling the strings. He picked up a broken clipper, its weight a reminder of the life he'd built and the truth he'd sworn to protect. The barbershop was more than a cover, it was his anchor, and Marcus Hayes would fight to keep it standing, no matter who stood in his way. The Chicago dawn broke over 63rd Street with a gray chill, the kind that seeped into bones and sharpened the edge of every shadow. But inside Marcus Hayes' barbershop, the air crackled with a different kind of tension, a quiet resolve that burned brighter than the flickering neon sign above the door. The shop, still bearing the scars of the police raid with its cracked mirrors and yellow tape dangling like war wounds, was no longer just a place for haircuts. It was a command post, a nerve center where Marcus, now openly a covert FBI agent, orchestrated the next phase of his mission to dismantle a drug trafficking empire that had poisoned the South Side for too long. He stood in the back room, his encrypted laptop casting a blue glow across his face, his sharp brown eyes scanning surveillance footage and wiretap transcripts that pointed to a truth he'd long suspected. The network wasn't just street dealers and club owners. It had roots in the Chicago PD, tendrils of corruption that protected the flow of drugs from the docks to the corners. The raid on his shop, led by the now suspended Officer Callahan, hadn't been a random act of prejudice. It was a calculated strike, ordered by someone high enough to pull strings and silence threats. Marcus's investigation had rattled that someone, and the fallout from his public confrontation at the community meeting, where he'd revealed his FBI status and accused the precinct of interference, had only tightened the noose. As he cross-referenced data, a knock at the shop's door snapped him back to the present, and he glanced through the blinds to see Dion, the teen who'd become his unofficial lookout, his face taut with urgency. Marcus opened the door, and Dion slipped inside, his voice low. "Agent Hayes, there's a guy sniffing around the block. Same dude with the scar who came for a trim last week. He's asking about you, saying you're stirring up trouble." Marcus's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to the stranger's probing questions, the veiled threat in his words. "Keep an eye on him," Marcus said, his tone steady but firm. "Don't engage, just watch." Dion nodded, his eyes fierce with loyalty, and Marcus felt a pang of responsibility. He was asking a kid to play a role in a game that could turn deadly, but Dion's trust was a lifeline he couldn't ignore. The community was rallying behind him, their faith restored by his defiance, but that faith came with a price. They were now targets, caught in the crosshairs of a network that thrived on fear. By midday, the FBI's presence in the neighborhood was unmistakable. Unmarked vans parked discreetly, agents in plainclothes blending into the crowd, their radios humming with updates as Marcus's investigation gained momentum. Special Agent Torres, his handler, joined him in the shop, her sharp features set in a frown as she reviewed his latest findings. "We've got a hit," she said, sliding a file across the counter. "Intercepted chatter from a burner phone tied to a mid-level dealer. They mentioned a fixer in the precinct, someone feeding them intel on our moves. The timing matches your raid." Marcus's pulse quickened, his eyes scanning the file, call logs, coded messages, a name that kept surfacing: Lieutenant Daniel Vaughn, a veteran officer with a clean record and a reputation for loyalty. Vaughn hadn't been at the raid, but his name had appeared in Marcus's notes before, linked to a dock worker who'd vanished after a tip to the FBI. "He's our link," Marcus said, his voice low, the pieces clicking into place. "Vaughn's been shielding the network, tipping them off. That's why they hit my shop. They knew I was getting close." Torres nodded, her voice grim. "We need hard evidence. If Vaughn's dirty, he's got allies, and they'll fight to protect him. You're walking a tightrope." Hayes, Marcus knew the risks. Exposing a cop like Vaughn would shake the precinct to its core, but it would also paint a bigger target on his back. As Torres left to coordinate a sting, the shop filled with regulars, their voices a mix of pride and fear. Mr. Jenkins, his cane tapping the floor, spoke up. "You're doing God's work, Marcus, but these cops ain't gonna roll over. You watch yourself." The warning hung heavy, and Marcus forced a smile, his clippers buzzing as he worked, his barber's charm masking the storm in his mind. That evening, the precinct was a powder keg, its halls tense with the news of Callahan's suspension in the FBI's investigation. Marcus arrived for a closed-door meeting with Captain Reynolds, who'd requested his input on restoring trust. The captain's office was a fortress of polished wood and framed commendations, but Reynolds' forced smile couldn't hide his unease. "Agent Hayes, we want to cooperate fully," he said, his voice strained. "But these accusations, collusion, corruption, they're serious. We need specifics." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "You want specifics? Start with Lieutenant Vaughn. Check his calls, his bank accounts, his meetings with informants who never show up in reports. Then tell me why my shop was raided the day after I flagged a shipment at the docks." Reynolds paled, his hands fidgeting, but before he could respond, the door burst open, and Vaughn himself stormed in, his face red with fury. "You've got some nerve, Hayes," Vaughn snarled, his voice a low growl. "Slinging lies to save your own skin. You think you can walk in here and tear us down?" Marcus stood, his presence towering despite his wiry frame, his voice calm but cutting. "I don't tear down what's already rotten. Lieutenant, you did that yourself." The room crackled with tension. Reynolds caught between them, and Marcus saw a flicker of fear in Vaughn's eyes, a crack in the man's armor that confirmed his suspicions. The meeting ended abruptly, but Marcus knew he'd struck a nerve. Back at the shop, he found a note slipped under the door, unsigned but chilling. "Stop digging, Barber, or the block burns." The threat was clear, a message from the network, and Marcus's gut told him Vaughn was the messenger. That night, as he locked up, a Molotov cocktail shattered through the shop's window, flames licking the walls, the roar of fire drowning out the street's silence. Marcus dove for cover, his heart pounding, but his resolve hardened. The network was desperate, Vaughn was cornered, and Marcus was ready to push them into the light. He grabbed his burner phone, texting Torres, "They're moving. Set the trap." The shop burned, but Marcus Hayes was already planning his counterstrike, his blade sharper than ever, ready to cut through the lies and bring the truth crashing down. The acrid smell of charred wood and melted plastic hung over Marcus Hayes' barbershop like a shroud. The blackened windows and scorched walls, a grim reminder of the Molotov cocktail that had torn through the Southside night. A desperate act by a drug trafficking network that knew its days were numbered. Marcus stood in the doorway at dawn, his sharp brown eyes tracing the damage, his wiry frame taut with a resolve that no fire could burn away. The shop, his cover as a covert FBI agent, was more than a front. It was a symbol, a beacon for a community that had rallied behind him since his public unmasking as a federal operative, and he'd be damned if he let it fall. The Chicago PD was reeling, its precinct a cauldron of fear and defiance as the FBI's investigation, led by Marcus and Special Agent Torres, dug deeper into the ties between corrupt officers and the drug empire poisoning the city. Lieutenant Daniel Vaughn, the precinct's fixer, whose name had surfaced in Marcus's files, was under scrutiny, his clean record unraveling as evidence of secret meetings and offshore accounts piled up. But the fight was far from over, and Marcus knew the network's desperation made them more dangerous than ever. As he sifted through the rubble, Dion appeared, his teenage face etched with worry, a crowbar in hand to help clear debris. "They're saying the cops are shook, Agent Hayes," he said, his voice low, glancing at the street where an unmarked FBI van idled. "But some of them ain't backing down. Heard one guy at the precinct talking about handling you." Marcus's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to Vaughn's furious outburst at their last meeting, the man's fear betraying his guilt. "Let him talk, Dion," he said, his tone steady but laced with steel. "They're running out of places to hide." The community was a powder keg, neighbors gathering daily to rebuild the shop, their hands hammering nails and painting walls, their voices a chorus of defiance against a precinct that had betrayed them. Mr. Jenkins, his cane now a prop for fiery speeches, rallied the block, declaring Marcus a hero, while women from the church brought food, their prayers a quiet strength. But Marcus felt the weight of their trust, knowing each act of support painted a bigger target on their backs. By midday, the precinct was under siege, not by protesters, but by procedure, as FBI agents swarmed its halls, seizing files and interviewing officers under Captain Reynolds' nervous gaze. Marcus arrived for a strategy session with Torres. The captain's office a stark contrast to the chaos outside, its polished wood and framed awards mocking the rot within. Reynolds, his face haggard, tried to play peacemaker. Agent Hayes, we're implementing reforms, sensitivity training, oversight boards. But we need time. The men are on edge, especially after Vaughn's suspension. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes unyielding. Time's a luxury you don't have. Captain, your men didn't just raid my shop. They protected a network that's killing kids on these streets. Vaughn's not the only one. Who else is dirty? Reynolds flinched, his hands trembling. But before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside. A group of veteran officers, loyal to Vaughn, stormed the hall, their voices raised in protest, one shouting, "Hayes is tearing us apart. He's no cop. He's a snitch." The words stung, a reminder of the divide Marcus straddled as an FBI agent in a community that distrusted badges. Torres stepped in, her voice a whip crack. "Back off, or you're next for questioning." The officers retreated, but their glares burned into Marcus, a promise of resistance that echoed the note he'd found in his shop. "Stop digging, or the block burns." That evening, as Marcus worked to salvage what he could from the shop, a new threat emerged. A black sedan, its windows tinted, cruised slowly past, its driver obscured but its message clear. Marcus's burner phone buzzed with a text from Torres. "Vaughn's talking. Named a contact, a dealer called Ghost. Oh, we're setting a sting at the docks. Be ready." The name hit Marcus like a jolt. Ghost was a phantom, a dealer who'd evaded every trap, linked to the network's core. If Vaughn was naming him, it was either a breakthrough or a setup, and Marcus's gut screamed the latter. He slipped into the back room, pulling up encrypted files that confirmed Ghost's ties to a shipment due at the port tomorrow night. A haul big enough to flood the city. The sting was his chance to catch Ghost and expose Vaughn's role, but the sedan's presence told him the network was watching, waiting to strike. As he prepared, the community gathered outside, their voices rising in a vigil for the shop, candles flickering against the dusk. Dion approached, his eyes fierce. "We got your back. Agent Hayes, whatever you're planning, we're in." Marcus hesitated, the kid's loyalty a double-edged sword, but he nodded, his voice low. "Stay sharp, Dion. Keep the block safe." The vigil was a shield, a signal that the South Side wouldn't bow, but Marcus knew the real fight was coming. That night, at the precinct, a tip came through. An officer, spooked by the FBI's pressure, had overheard Vaughn on a burner phone, arranging a cleanup at the docks. Marcus and Torres moved fast, coordinating with a tactical team. But as they geared up, a second attack hit the shop. Gunshots rang out, bullets shattering what remained of the windows, sending neighbors scrambling for cover. Marcus, alerted by Dion's frantic call, raced back, his heart pounding as he found the shop empty but riddled with bullet holes. A message scrawled in paint across the wall. "Last warning." The community was shaken, their vigil scattered. But Marcus stood firm, his eyes blazing with a fury he could no longer contain. This wasn't just about the network. It was personal, a war on the people he'd sworn to protect. He texted Torres, "Docs, tomorrow, Ghost, Vaughn, all of them. We end this." The shop was in ruins, the precinct was fracturing, and the network was closing in. But Marcus Hayes was done playing defense. He was a blade, honed by years in the shadows, and he was ready to cut through the heart of the empire, no matter the cost. The South Side watched, their candles relit, their voices rising again. And Marcus knew he wasn't fighting alone. The Chicago docks at midnight were a labyrinth of steel and shadow, the air thick with the tang of salt water and diesel, the distant hum of cranes a heartbeat under the moonless sky. Marcus Hayes crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, his wiry frame taut, his sharp brown eyes locked on the flickering lights of a warehouse where the drug trafficking network he'd hunted for 18 months was about to meet its end. His FBI badge, hidden beneath a dark jacket, was a silent reminder of the vow he'd made to protect the South Side, to carve justice from the chaos of a city that had underestimated him. The sting operation, planned with Special Agent Torres and a tactical team, was his final move, a trap to catch Ghost, the elusive dealer, and expose Lieutenant Daniel Vaughn, the precinct's corrupt fixer whose betrayal had fueled the raid on Marcus's barbershop. The shop, now a charred husk after gunfire and Molotov cocktails, stood as a testament to the network's desperation. But Marcus was done hiding. Tonight, he was no longer the barber playing a role. He was a blade, honed by years in the shadows, ready to cut through the empire that had poisoned his community. His burner phone vibrated, Torres's voice a whisper through his earpiece. Ghost is in position. Vaughn's with him. Team's ready. You call the shot. Marcus's pulse quickened, his mind racing through months of leads, dock workers, club owners, coded messages, all pointing to this moment. The raid on his shop, Callahan's suspension, the community's defiance, it had all led here, to a showdown that would either break the network or bury him. He signaled the team, his voice low. Move in, now. The warehouse erupted in controlled chaos, FBI agents storming through side doors, flashlights cutting through the dark, shouts of federal agents, hands up, echoing off steel walls. Marcus moved with precision, his gun drawn but steady, his eyes locked on Ghost, a lean figure in a hooded jacket, unloading crates with Vaughn at his side. The lieutenant's face, illuminated by a floodlight, was a mask of panic as agents closed in, his hands fumbling for a weapon he never reached. Ghost bolted, weaving through crates, but Marcus was faster, tackling him to the ground. The dealer's curses muffled as cuffs snapped onto his wrists. Vaughn, cornered, raised his hands, his voice trembling. Hayes, you don't understand, I had no choice. Marcus stood, his gaze unyielding, his voice a low growl. You had a choice. Vaughn, you chose to sell out your badge, your city, your people. The words cut deeper than any blade, and Vaughn's shoulders slumped, his guilt laid bare as agents led him away. The warehouse raid was a triumph, seizing millions in product and exposing a network that stretched from Chicago's ports to its precincts. But Marcus knew the real victory was back on 63rd Street. By dawn, the South Side was alive with news of the bust, TV crews swarming the docks, reporters shouting questions about the barber who broke the cartel. Marcus returned to his shop, its blackened walls now a canvas for community murals, bright colors, faces of hope, a testament to their resilience. Dion met him at the door, his teenage grin wide, a paintbrush in hand. We're rebuilding, Agent Hayes. Ain't nobody stopping us now. Marcus clapped his shoulder, his heart swelling at the sight of neighbors hammering boards, women from the church singing, Mr. Jenkins directing traffic with his cane. The shop wasn't just a cover anymore. It was a legacy, a symbol of what they could achieve together. The precinct, gutted by the FBI's investigation, was unrecognizable. Captain Reynolds resigned, replaced by a reform-minded leader who worked with Marcus to root out corruption. Vaughn and a handful of officers faced charges, their confessions unraveling the network's protections, while Callahan, already suspended, disappeared into obscurity, his bravado a distant memory. Marcus, now a public figure, faced new challenges, reporters hounding him, the network's remnants whispering threats. But he embraced his role, speaking at schools and churches, his voice a clarion call for justice. One evening, as the shop reopened, its new mirrors gleaming under fresh lights, Marcus stood before a crowd, Dion at his side, the teen now enrolled in a law enforcement program inspired by his mentor. This shop, Marcus said, his voice steady, resonant, wasn't just about haircuts. It was about us, our strength, our fight, our right to be seen. They tried to burn us down, but we rose and will keep rising because no one can take our truth. The crowd cheered, their applause a wave that carried into the night, and Marcus saw in their eyes the spark of a generation that would demand better. He thought of the boy who'd watched planes as a child, dreaming of a world beyond the block, and realized he'd become the man to build it. The FBI offered him a desk job, but Marcus stayed on the south side, his shop a hub for change, his badge a tool to protect, not to divide. The network was broken, the community healed, but Marcus knew the fight for justice was never over. He looked at Dayon, at the kids painting murals, at the neighbors who'd stood with him, and felt a quiet pride. This was his Desan, a legacy of truth that would outlast any fire, any raid, any lie. As the shop's neon sign flickered back to life, Marcus Hayes stood tall, his clippers ready, his heart full, knowing he'd cut a path for others to follow, a path where justice wasn't just a dream, but a reality they could all hold. From a raided barbershop to busting a drug empire, Marcus Hayes proved justice prevails. Thanks for listening. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell for more epic stories. Don't miss our next video.